Good morning. I want to give you an overview today of the barrier analysis tool. Barrier analysis studies help staff to better understand how to successfully promote behavior change by identifying the most important barriers and enablers of key behaviors promoted in development projects. Barrier analysis also can help you to know which beliefs need to change, to see those behavior changes, and helps you to identify which social norms need to change and how they need to change. So barrier analysis is a rapid assessment tool used to identify behavioral determinants associated with a particular behavior, for example, positive parenting, so that you can develop more effective behavior change messages and activities. One of the key features is those doing behavior, who we call the doers, are compared with those who are not, called the non-doers, so that the most important behavioral determinants can be identified. These are a few of the behavioral determinants examined with barrier analysis. We'll be talking about a few of those, but there are about 12 in all, and you can add in, of course, some of your own questions to explore other determinants. Let me give you a little bit of background on the method. World Vision has used barrier analysis extensively in their WASH programs and in some of their health and nutrition programs. But I don't believe it has been used yet in World Vision education, livelihoods, or child protection programs, or in our advocacy and external engagement work. Other organizations, though, have used barrier analysis in these other sectors. It was developed by myself back in 1990 and disseminated largely through the core Social and Behavior Change Working Group and the Food Security and Nutrition Network. It was developed out of the need for a standardized tool to discover determinants of key behaviors promoted in development projects in developing countries to be able to boost behavior change. Since then, it's been used by more than 34 NGOs in more than 33 countries around the world to study different behaviors. And it's designed using two main theories from the scientific literature on behavior change: the health belief model and the theory of reasoned action. We won't be going into those since this is normally about a 5-day training and we're only going to be taking less than 45 minutes for this presentation. Let me explain why this comparison of doers and non-doers is critical in understanding what will help people to change. Let's say that you do a survey of caregivers in a World Vision area program or a collection of APs, and you ask them questions to get at why do some parents use positive parenting and others don't. You explain positive parenting and then ask them if God approves of positive parenting, and 81% yes. This is assessing one of the determinants, perceived divine will. To assess perceived self-efficacy, you ask if they know how to use some positive parenting techniques, and 76% say yes, they do, the second bar. You ask if their partner approves of their using positive parenting, and 40% say yes, their partner approves. That's perceived social norms. And you ask what they think the advantages are of using positive parenting, and 22% mention that the child eats better when they use it, the most common response that they gave amongst other responses. So knowing this, what would you focus on changing to get people to use positive parenting, and why? A lot of people would say focus on the determinants that are low, those last two, such as perceived social norms and the perceived consequences, the last two bars. And this is where we make a central mistake. Just because those two are low doesn't mean that they're driving behavior. Now let's look at what that may look like if you were to compare doers and non-doers, those using positive parenting, that those who do not use positive parenting, asking the very same questions. Now, which things would you focus on and why? Note that although perceived social norms, whether the person doing the behavior thinks that others important to them approve of it, was relatively low, it doesn't seem to be driving the behavior. It's not associated with adopting the behavior any more than not believing it. They're about at the same level. So in this situation, you would not need to focus on it. In contrast, the perceived consequence of the behavior does appear to be associated with it, and the belief that God approves of the behavior is also associated with the adoption of the behavior. In this case, we would focus on increasing the proportion of people who believe that God approves of positive parenting, working through faith leaders most likely, and also to use that message, the message that your child may eat better if you use positive parenting, as a way to promote it. This is the beauty of barrier analysis. It allows you to identify those differences between doers and non-doers and concentrate on those underlying beliefs which are much more likely to be driving the behavior. This is made up data for this, and it would not be useful to you since the determinants that are important can vary a lot from region to region, culture group to cultural group, and country to country. But I use it to make a point. Also, we have plenty of real data on other behaviors where we can demonstrate this relationship. For example, this is from a barrier analysis study that was done in the Eastern Caribbean on condom use. And remember, the key point here is that just using survey data without dividing out doers and non-doers doesn't help you that much when you try to find out what helps people adopt a behavior or not. Barrier analysis helps you to do the analysis using rapid surveys and then to decide what you'll do with the results. This is why it's currently being used by so many INGOs in so many countries. Okay, so let's take a step back about how barrier analysis is done. At its base, it's a survey. You ask a series of questions to identify 12 potential determinants that can hinder or enable people from adopting a behavior. It's a type of formative research and one in which we have not been required to get special approval to be able to do it. And it's very helpful in terms of making decisions about projects. So you ask a series of questions to identify 12 potential determinants that can hinder or enable people from adopting behavior. You then compare the responses of people who do the behavior, the doers, with those who do not, the non-doers. And that can be very useful in identifying the most important barriers and enablers. It takes about 1 to 2 days for each behavior study. If you have a larger group of interviewers, you can actually study more behaviors in the same amount of time. And it doesn't need a huge sample size. You need about 45 doers versus 45 non-doers. That's adequate. And it avoids identifying really small associations that are really not that important and don't drive the behavior as much. So when doing behavior, which is more important? Your motivation to do it, or the absence of things that block you from doing it? Well, the truth is both can be. And in fact, when I first developed this tool, we used an actual physical balance that looked like this, which made it clear that sometimes there are positive attributes of behavior that can outweigh all of those possible barriers. And in some ways, I wish we would have called the methodology barrier and enabler analysis, since those enablers are often important too. But it's too late really to change the name now. So we won't have time today to go through all of the determinants that are standardly assessed, but let's talk about a few of the most important ones. These are some of the ones that you should really assess in any study that you do, any barrier analysis study. Note the yellow star for this one, perceived self-efficacy. It's one of the most important determinants found to be important in barrier analysis studies. And when we looked at 150 different BA studies, 86% found this one to be significant. And it makes sense. If you don't think you can do a particular behavior because you don't have the time, money, or skills, the odds of your doing that behavior are quite low. So even when you don't use barrier analysis, you should be thinking about how to use the messages and activities around boosting self-efficacy, perceived self-efficacy, in order to boost behavior change. Next, perceived social norms. These are often, but not always, important for behavioral adoption. About 3/4 of BA studies done find this determinant to be important, so you should always be considering messaging and actions around social norms when promoting behavior change. The question is the preventive action socially acceptable? And if someone thinks that their neighbors or family would criticize them for adopting a particular practice, they're much less likely to do it. An example of that would be if someone thinks that their mother-in-law disapproves of positive parenting, even if they know how to do it, even if others approve, they may not adopt it. Negative and positive consequences of the behavior. This may not have anything to do with child well-being or the community development outcomes. It may have to do with personal preferences and taste. For example, Toothbrushing increased in the US when marketers began promoting it as something that made you brush your breath fresh and made you more kissable. That before they were just talking about the health effects of it, and they didn't get as many people brushing. Washing hands is also a behavior where they found that sometimes people do it so that their hands smell good. Well, we should use that motivation. Perception of divine will is another determinant. Is it God's will or the God's will that I should not have the problem or that I should overcome the problem? If someone believes that it is not God's will that they avoid or be released from a disease or problem, then they'll probably be less likely to do anything to try to avoid or to be released from it themselves. And sometimes you just need to ask whether they think God approves of the behavior that you're doing, that you're promoting. If someone believes, for example, that positive parenting is sparing the rod and spoiling the child, they may be more likely to not use positive parenting. So we need to take that into account. There are 8 other determinants assessed in behavior analysis studies. The full behavior analysis training, as I said, is about a week, and it's often taught as part of the Designing for Behavior Change training. So 45 minutes doesn't give us a lot of time to build your skills and to hear your questions, but let's talk about the major steps in behavior analysis. First is defining the behavior and priority group. Priority group, who do you want to practice behavior? And the behavior usually needs to be pretty specific. Second, develop the behavior screening questions, those questions that you use to see if someone's a doer or a non-doer. And it's a little bit more tricky than you might imagine. Third, develop the behavior analysis questionnaire and pre-test it. This is often a questionnaire of about 3 or 4 pages with a lot of space for writing in answers because some of the questions are open-ended, some are closed-ended. Organize the field work, that is, decide which villages to visit and which team will be going where. Collect the field data, actually do the interviews out in the community. You code the questionnaire responses, usually manually, having people raise fingers and hands depending on how many people gave a particular response. You do that in a group with your interviewers. Then you tabulate those, writing down the numbers. You analyze it and you interpret the results. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that's done in a minute. Then you use the results to come up with key messages and actions to address those key determinants that were discussed. The full behavior analysis training, as I said, is about a week, and it's so here's an example. After you've tabulated the data, you've counted how many people gave each response, you plug it into an Excel sheet that we developed that looks like this. Notice the colored cells on the left-hand side. When you plug in the total doers and non-doers interviewed at the top and how many people gave each response, the green cells down below, the spreadsheet automatically identifies the differences that are statistically significant, the ones that you need to pay attention to, that are not due to just chance differences. You should ignore all the rest. For example, this was a behavior analysis study on mothers of preschool children who chlorinated their child's drinking water. And note that when asked about social norms, who disapproved of chlorination, they also ask who approved of it. The non-doers, those who don't chlorinate, were 3 times more likely to say that their mother or mother-in-law disapproved, and 6.9 times more likely to say that their father or father-in-law disapproved. Neighbors also were a problem. So this should have made it clear to the project staff that if they wanted to change this behavior, they couldn't just talk about the benefits of it and how to do it with the parents of the child. They needed to be talking to a much wider group of people. And that's not unusual, but it's amazing how often we forget that. So in terms of interpreting this data, you're looking at the differences between doers and non-doers as to who approves or disapproves of the behavior. And that might provide information that's important on who to target for your intervention. Who do you need to be talking to? Doers' responses may include ideas for strategies on how to make the behavior easier or more appealing, and could provide clues for messages to non-doers. You need to examine those very carefully as well. For example, in ours, we mentioned earlier, it might be something like, it makes my hands smell good, or it makes my child grow. Sometimes more doers can list a particular disadvantage of the behavior than non-doers. That is, people doing it might talk about something being negative about the behavior promoted than those who aren't doing it. For those, you can note it down for future promotion of behavior maintenance. That is, this might be something that people only realize when they start practicing it, a negative of it, that you want to help them work through so they keep doing the behavior. So I mentioned the Designing for Behavior Change training. This is the DBC framework, which is what you usually use to show what you studied, what you found, and what you plan to do about it. This was from a study I led when working with Food for the Hungry in Mozambique. And let's work through this table so you can understand it. So you start on the left with the behavior you want to promote and study. In this case, exclusive breastfeeding a child to the child's 6th month of life with or without giving any other food or drinks. This is a life-saving behavior, so there have been a lot of BA studies conducted on it. The second column lists who you want to adopt the behavior, or who you will study to learn more about its adoption. With this behavior, you want to promote it among pregnant women so that they can exclusively breastfeed as soon as a child is born. But to study it, you have to know who a doer and a non-doer is, so we often study it by talking to women with a child 6 to 18 months of age, asking what they did versus what they're doing. You don't need to do that for most behaviors, but this is a particular one. The third column is where you list all of the determinants studied in your behavior analysis study. We put the ones in red that were found to be important, and we can largely ignore the others. And notice this is pretty much the same list that we presented earlier of all the different determinants we recommend that are studied actively. Then there's the bridges to activities, which are basically the objectives you set related to the determinants. So perceived social norms was found to be important. So the objective is to increase the perception that extended family members support exclusive breastfeeding. Ideally, those family members will support exclusive breastfeeding, but the important thing is that mothers perceive that family members support it, since that seems to be driving the behavior. Here are a few of the other things that we listed as objectives. And then the last column is the activities. And this is where you list what you're going to do as a result of the behavior analysis study. And note that some of these things are messages that we'll put into the curricula used, for example, a care group curricula. But others are strategies like having pastors and imams promote exclusive breastfeeding by using sermon outlines and tools like that. Here are some of the findings from that study. For example, mothers who said, I can exclusively breastfeed with my current knowledge and skills, that is perceived self-efficacy, were 7.4 times more likely to exclusively breastfeed. Mothers who said that God approved were 5 times more likely to do it. And we often see that with behaviors that are hardest to change, there are multiple important barriers that need to be overcome. You don't necessarily need to change all of these, but you do need to be thinking about all these different barriers that exist that are important and really focus your time on that, and don't spend so much time on the other ones that don't seem to be important. Once again, by comparing doers and non-doers, you can find which determinants are most influencing behavioral adoption. So these are the 3 that seem to really make a difference: perceived self-efficacy, perceived social norms, perceived divine will in this study of exclusive breastfeeding. The study changed a few things we did after doing this study in the program. One is that we use more messaging around the low cost of exclusive breastfeeding and other advantages that doers mentioned that were found to be important. And here's what we found after doing the behavior analysis study early in the project and using the results from that to promote the behavior. Exclusive breastfeeding rose from 17% at baseline to 95% at final. You don't see that sort of change in a behavior very often. For example, we consider a good increase in nutrition behaviors to be about 10 or 15 points or more. This one increased by 78 percentage points. And partly due to that, we saw a 42% drop in underweight in children in less than 3 years. So by really focusing on these important behaviors, we did one on exclusive breastfeeding, one on chlorination of water, other things that we knew were associated with a child's ability to gain weight there. we were able to bring down underweight, malnutrition in a very significant way. But behavior analysis doesn't just help you to decide what to do at the individual and family levels, but also the community and policy levels. For example, at the community level, it can help you to know what changes need to happen in messages and services from religious leaders and other community leaders. Policy changes can also be spurred by these studies, such as promoting that community health workers and other staff need to be involved in screening for violence against children. It might also influence things like what hours a health facility is open and doing that screening for violence against children. Thank you very much.